Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, I got a lot I want to try and run through today, so let's just get right into this. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows and the information coming. So, if you enjoy the discussions, the topics, the lectures, the revelations, the guests and the hosts on the other shows of the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member, even if it's as little as $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. And of course, if you want to get fully informed and properly educated on my favorite topic on this show, which is the maladministration of the federal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal court judges for the last 50 years, which has been completely exposed by a Supreme Court decision last year, you need to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading the articles, learn what's been done to the American people, pushing the socialist nonsense and constitutional fraud that the liberal federal judges have jammed down your throat, along with all the other bad decisions of the liberal court of the 50s and the 60s, where they gave you Roe v. Wade, an invention for a right to abortion that doesn't exist. They gave you the doctrine of regulatory deference under Chevron. Let's just let the bureaucrats write their own law and rule the country. And of course, they gave you affirmative action. And they gave you the supposed non-apportioned direct tax on income. None of these things existed, ever. They were all liberal constitutional fraud perpetrated by the federal judges who just made it up, thinking they knew better than the Constitution. They didn't need Congress and an amendment. They're just going to make it up. And because of allowing them to just make it up, we've been ruled by the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto, and the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto since World War II, with the second plank being a graduated income tax, non-uniform direct taxation of the people, enabling the government to rule. They just made it up. It's communism. The second plank is a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Non-uniform taxation of every dollar the people earn. Absolutely inconceivable to the founding fathers that any American, as a result of earning a dollar, would owe tax to the federal government. Absolutely inconceivable. It's your property, the fruits of labor, not the government's. They have no claim to it, neither territorial or legislatively. There's no constitutional power to tax directly that's made enforceable by an enabling enforcement clause. There's none in the 16th Amendment. The judges knew that. They didn't care. They just made it up to enslave you so that they can get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars while you go broke for lack of access to capital because the Federal Reserve Bank has set interest rates so high that Main Street can't borrow without going bankrupt. So, if you want to learn about it, taxfreedom.com and start reading. Okay, let's break out here and talk a little bit about current events, or at least some topics I've seen on TV. You know, I keep hearing people on TV talking about the American dream, and this actually comes mostly from the conservative side. the newscasters are talking about it's the American dream, and they keep referring to starting a business and succeeding and getting wealthy. The American dream, to own your own home and start your own business and become wealthy and independent. No, no. The American dream was not to be wealthy. It was to be free. And they have perverted the dream by telling you it's about money rather than freedom. The American dream was always to be free, to live your life as you see fit, to work and keep what you accumulate through the application of labor and intelligence. The dream was to be free, never to start your own business and be wealthy. That might be a result of being left free, but it's not the dream of the majority of the people. So, this American dream, make sure they understand the dream is to be free, not rich. Money isn't part of the equation. Okay, on the economy, well, you got some good news on the economy. The first quarter, last quarter under Biden, January through March, that's not really Trump's economic policy that's in place when he takes office there in January 20th. So the first quarter is on Biden, down 0.6%. Second quarter numbers came in. First quarter under Trump, up 3.8% gross domestic product. They were anticipating 3.3, so they knew it was going to be better economy than Biden gave you. But 3.8% is almost a 4% growth. That's remarkable, from a -6 to 4% in one quarter. Well, the mainstream media and the Democrats were raving about how tariffs were going to destroy everything. Well, they didn't. They've rebuilt the American economy. And of course, there's a lot of talk about Comey. James Comey is going to get indicted for the crimes he committed against Trump, although they can't get him for the real crime, which was lying to the FISA court about the Russia collusion nonsense to get the warrants issued on General Flynn and Trump and start spying on the administration when they first took office back in 2017. So Comey, it looks like he's going to get indicted finally. They can't go past the 5 years, but that looks like it might happen. They're after his ass for all the lies he told and the anti-Trump rhetoric that he engaged in, which almost amounted to an attempted coup to try and replace the properly elected president. And, okay, we are approaching, as I said last week, a government shutdown. The Democrats have decided they don't want to fund a continuing resolution. The Republicans passed a clean Republican resolution in the House to keep the government open for the next 6 weeks while they figure out the spending bills. But the Democrats don't want to do it. The Democrat Senate under Schumer is shutting down the country and demanding that if Trump wants a bill to stay open for 6 weeks, that they put $2 trillion, $2 trillion for Obamacare subsidies, or they won't deal. So the Democrats are going to shut down the country because Congress won't give the big healthcare companies that ran the COVID scam on the American people another $2 trillion, because these subsidies don't go to the American people. They go right to the healthcare providers, the insurers. The people that paid the big bonuses and take the $50 million salaries, that's where the money's going. $2 trillion to pay the rich, wealthy healthcare companies more money, or they're going to let the country shut down. I say let it shut down. Let it shut down. Next Tuesday, they run out of money. They should shut it down. And this time, Donald Trump should do what I said he should do last time. He should not just fire a few people who are, turns out, not essential, which is what happens with the government shutdown, right? They go into this essential, non-essential analysis and keep little everything open because it's all essential. And they just run on a deficit and pay people when they get it out and the money's available again. So this time, instead of just firing a few non-essential people, Donald Trump should take the Democrats at their word and shut it all down. He should close all of the government agencies that are not authorized in the Constitution and make most of them a small office of 10 to 20 people in the Department of the Interior. What am I talking about? Well, let's go through the government agencies and offices that exist and when they were created and how much budget they're getting to see what kind of result we could get if we reorganized some of the spending so that it was distributed to the states to take care of these functions that are not in the Constitution for the federal government to do. So we have the Army, which was created in 1775. This is even before the Declaration of Independence, but that's the date the Army goes back to. It's the date the Navy goes back to. It's the date the Marine Corps goes back to, and it's the date the Post Office goes back to. So in 1775, as a function of the government, they set up, before the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Post Office. And basically, that's to facilitate fighting the war. In 1789, after the Constitution was adopted in 1788, they formed the State Department, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, and 1 year later, in 1790, they created the Coast Guard, which was put inside the Navy, which was, of course, constitutionally authorized. So that's all there was for the first 50 years, 60 years. In 1849, as the slavery issue began to tear apart the United States, they created the Department of the Interior. It didn't exist until 1849, and they didn't amend the Constitution to create a Department of Interior. And they don't have any territorial jurisdiction in the interior, only a jurisdiction over interstate transport, interstate goods, and international trade. So what was the Interior Department supposed to do? Manage the slaves in the states? Manage the no slaves in the states? And in 1862, they created the Agricultural Department because, of course, Lincoln needed food to feed the troops. So the Agricultural Department was a function of the Civil War. Again, no constitutional authority. Lincoln just made it up. And the Justice Department didn't exist until 1870, when they needed to prosecute the Southerners who wouldn't go along with the end of the war and the termination of slavery. So the Justice Department got created in 1870 to prosecute Southerners who objected to the end of the war and the loss of the war and the end of slavery. They're still arguing it's confiscation of private property. So that went on until 1903, when they created the Commerce Department. In 1913, they created the Labor Department, just about the same time World War I was ginning up. Isn't that convenient? And then in 1947, they created the Air Force. But you know what? They forgot to amend the Constitution. There's no authority in the Constitution for an Air Force. It's unconstitutional. This is one of the things Congress has dropped the ball on. You can't just make these things up. If you want to have an Air Force and write money for it every year in the budget, you need to have it authorized at the constitutional level. We need an amendment that allows an Air Force. And any congressman who won't vote for that amendment in a simple function and form, just like the provisions that provide for the Army and the Navy, they shouldn't be in office. If you don't think we need an Air Force today, you are ignorant of our history, because it's been the Air Force that's controlled the outcome of every single conflict since World War I. Housing and Urban Development, 1965. Transportation, 1967. EPA, 1970. OSHA, 1970. The Energy Department was Carter under the oil embargo with Iran, 1977. Health and Human Services, 1979. Education Department, 1979. The Veterans Affairs, 1989, Homeland Security, 2002, and the Space Force, which should be in the Air Force after they write an amendment to allow the Air Force, was in 2016. So there you have it. You had all these departments created without any constitutional authority long after the original formation of the government, using emergencies as an excuse to usurp federal authority. We'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get right back to it. As the commercial break came up, I was identifying all of the federal agencies and departments that exist today and pointing out that none of them have an authority in the Constitution that allows the government to be engaged in these activities. And the fact that the government is spending recklessly trillions of dollars on all of these unauthorized activities, we need to address how the government spends money. And we need to stop it because they're going to destroy the currency. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life of its people. If you keep running it out and printing it up, you're going to destroy everything. We need to get a handle on the reckless government spending. And the way to do it is to take all of these government agencies for which there is no constitutional authority and eliminate them. And eliminate them. That will cut the budget. Oh, but that shock of the economic loss of the spending will be too great. Okay, I agree. Instead of just cutting off the money entirely when we eliminate the government agency in its entirety because there's no constitutional authority for it, why don't we take all of the collective funds and funding for those unauthorized departments and agencies and cut it by 10% every year until the budget is balanced. And then we should take those funds, cut 10%, and distribute them to the state legislatures, the state governments, in proportion to the census, for the state governments to decide how to spend in those areas not constitutionally authorized, like agriculture. Agriculture is not a federal matter, that's a state matter, and it's different in every state, and each state legislature should have the power to decide for its own people what its agricultural policies are and where agricultural dollars will be spent in that state. It shouldn't be dictated by the federal government. That should be a state decision, and if the state had the money that the Department of Agriculture has, if each state had their proportionate share, you would get a much, much better management of agriculture across the whole United States. Same thing with labor, housing, transportation, energy, education, environmental protection, occupational safety and health. None of these are federal functions. Every single one of these agencies and departments should be eliminated in its entirety, turned into a 20-person office in the Department of Interior to coordinate with the 50 states so that they can see how each state is spending the money, and each state can see what the other states are doing, and each state can adopt whatever platforms, programs, and policies work best for its people in its state's demographics. And believe me, you're going to get different policies and programs in Wyoming than you're going to get in Connecticut and New Jersey. They got entirely different sets of demographic realities to deal with to provide service. So the Fed shouldn't be dictating one policy to all 50 states. Each state should be allowed the budgetary freedom to decide its policies for itself. But they don't have access to the Federal Reserve Bank's printing of money and unlimited funds. So give it to them. Give it to them. End the federal agencies. Add up all the money and distribute it to the states to spend on agriculture, education, energy, environmental protection, occupational safety. Let each state spend the money, and they won't mind that the collective budget got cut by 10% because they didn't get a dime last year. Anything they get next year will be better than the nothing they got last year, and they're going to be told ahead of time it's going to be slashed 10% every year. So use the first couple of years to build your infrastructure, and the years after that to maintain it and run it. Now, how much money are we talking about? Well, Health and Human Services, HHS, spends $2.3 trillion every year. But 1.7 trillion of that is Medicare, and I'm not proposing we terminate Medicare and Medicaid yet. Even though they're not authorized either, I'm not proposing we get rid of them. Just the other 600 billion in HHS, the 213 billion in agriculture, the 15.4 in commerce, the 14.6 in labor, the 72.6 in HUD housing, the 146 billion in transportation, the 51 billion in energy, the 268 billion in education, the 11 billion in the EPA, and the 1 billion at OSHA. Collectively, we're talking $1.452 billion, $1.5 trillion, 1,452 billion, $1.5 trillion. And we're going to cut it 10%. So we'll eliminate 150 billion, and that leaves just over 1.3 trillion to be proportionately distributed to each state so that every single state capital can be the source of funding for projects in that state. And this way you'll have money being spent out of 51 different capitals instead of one. And the reason why that makes a difference is because when the federal government spends the money, all the money is spent out of Washington, D.C., and it all goes to multinational corporate giants that don't do anything locally for any state. So all the money is monopolized by huge institutions. If you broke that up, you'd have contracts being let out of all 50 state capitals. And sure, some of the big multinational companies will win those contracts too, but at least that will guarantee the work is done in the state, not anywhere else. And not just in Washington, D.C. So you need to shut down. The governments are handing you the opportunity to do it. They want to close the government. They want $2 trillion to be given to the healthcare giants to subsidize their Obamacare insurance subsidies. A program, a law, not one single Republican voted for. And now the Democrats want $2 trillion more. You're $37 trillion in the hole. They want $2 trillion more. Guaranteed. Permanent. Forget it. Forget it. Obamacare's a fraud. It never should have been sustained by the Supreme Court, who had to rewrite the law as a tax in order to get it in place. This was judicial legislation by the Chief Justice, Roberts. And I'll bet you dollar to donuts, the same decision wouldn't stand today if the case went back. You'd have a 5-4 decision with Roberts being part of the 4. The other 5 all know. All know Roberts rewrote the law through judicial legislation. It was criminal judicial legislation by Roberts to save Obama's namesake program. None of these agencies that are in the Constitution, all of them should be eliminated. The Democrats want to close the government. Good, let's close the government. Let's abolish all of these agencies, turn them into a 20-person office in the Department of Interior to coordinate with the states, slash the budget across the board by 10% of these agencies that are being closed, and distribute the money to the states, and you continue to slash that element of the budget by 10% every year until the budget is balanced. Now, I think you should also be slashing the rest of the budget 5% every year until the budget is balanced, but Congress doesn't seem to be able to slash a single line in the budget. So let's just get rid of all these agencies and departments for which there is no constitutional authority. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of the Air Force and the Space Force. I'm suggesting you pass a constitutional amendment that allows the Air Force, the same way you have a clause in the Constitution that authorizes the Army and the Navy. You can copy that, put Air Force in, and you're done. Congress needs to create the constitutional authority for the government to take over these areas. The fact that no authority was ever granted is why we're now living under the rule of an unlimited bureaucracy. has been allowed to write its own laws under Chevron, regulatory deference, the doctrine of Chevron, and steal all the money it needs to rule you from its ever increasing bureaucratic position of authority, usurping more and more authority with every month and year that passes. There's no authority for the federal government to be involved in education in the 50 states. They shouldn't be controlling the curriculum, and the fact that they are is why you have an ignorant population that can't read or write. The people graduating from high school are not employable when they graduate from public school. Literally, 70% are not employable. The government has watered down the education system so that it no longer teaches reading, writing, and arithmetic or history. It teaches agenda, philosophy, pronouns. Socialism is what they're teaching. Riots, chaos, anarchy, protest, disrupt. Communist, socialist disruption. Owns of the means of production by the state. So, we've got the opportunity to fix it. The Democrats are going to close the government. Trump shouldn't just fire a whole bunch of non-essential workers. He should terminate every single one of these agencies and departments that isn't authorized to exist, slash the budget across the board for all of them 10%, and distribute the money to the states to start spending. You would have an economic boom if Congress did that. All that money being spent out of the state capitals to improve agriculture, education, housing, transportation, energy, environmental. You could actually get things done in the states if they had the money to manage these areas. And the reason why the federal agencies exist is because the states didn't have access to the capital sufficient to do all of these things. So the federal government, oh, well, we'll step in and take care of it for you. We'll dictate the education curriculum. We'll dictate windmills and solar instead of gas or oil. We'll dictate a minimum wage. We'll dictate the educational curriculum. We'll dictate how you deal with your drainage ditches and overflow ponds. The EPA will claim it's a navigable waterway, and now it's controlled by us, the federal government. Because we're an unlimited, unregulated bureaucracy that gets to make up our own rules and laws to jam down your throat so that you can be ruled. Ruled, not represented. Because the liberals know they're a minority. The group of people that want everything to change and become more liberal is always a minority because most people want things to stay the way they know how things work. They're afraid of catastrophic change. So the liberals know they'll always be in a minority. And the only way they can get their policies, programs, and philosophies put in place is if they're allowed to rule as a minority by creating the appearance, the possible appearance of a majority. Because the mainstream media can always create the appearance of a majority through the manipulation of the statistics in the polls that they take. You just ask different questions and it looks like everybody's for the liberal position. But if you phrase the question different, you would have gotten a different response. So the media is helping the liberal politicians distort the truth to present all of this fraudulent exercise of unauthorized government power that's bankrupting the American people, running out the currency, making capital and access to it impossible for Main Street, while Wall Street and the millionaires go nuts. Okay, I think I hear the second commercial break coming up. We'll be back in 5 with more on how to fix the country. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get right back into this, and we're talking about how to reorganize government spending so that we can get a handle on the deficit, which is running out of control because of the reckless, nonsensical, unauthorized federal spending. It is, of course, being used to enrich the politicians themselves. Look at Nancy Pelosi and the others in the Democrat Party, as well as their cronies, friends, and business partners. Now, I'm not saying the Republicans aren't doing the same thing, but the result is 37 trillion and a half running endlessly, and we're running it out. It's going to destroy the country. As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation. Wake up! You cannot survive a destroyed currency. Look at history, over and over and over again. You print it into oblivion, and everything in the nation is destroyed. Everything. You're playing with hellfire, which is what will result if we don't take these opportunities to rein back in the federal government. So when they close next Tuesday, they're going to close. Trump should jump all over this and get rid of the Departments of Agriculture, Labor, Housing, Transportation, Energy, Education, EPA, OSHA. All of these should go away. Terminate them immediately. Take the collective $1.5 trillion budget dollars, slash it by 10%, and take the resultant $1.3 trillion and divide it amongst the states so that they can spend the money in the state to start economy and to fix the energy, the education, the housing, the agriculture, the environment in their own state. Federal government shouldn't be dictating to all 50 states policies in any of these areas. They should all be under the control of the states, and they would be if only the states had some access to the capital the federal government recklessly lends out, spends for itself, not for the country, for itself, to increase federal power, which is why federal government has gotten nothing but bigger, more invasive, more bureaucratic, and more strangling of the American people since the end of World War II. When Eisenhower, remember Eisenhower, a freedom-loving president, allowed a tax rate of over 90%. That's what he got saddled with by the Congress. And he signed it. Absolute nonsense. So what happens if we give these funds slashed by 10% to the state governments? Well, let's look at the numbers. California has a state budget of $322 billion. $322 billion. They have 11.95, 12% of the population. So their proportionate share of the 1.5 trillion would be 173 billion in addition to the 322 they already spend. That's more than 50% more budget dollars for the state of California. Texas spends $321 billion. Their proportionate share of the population is about 9%. They'd get $126 billion to spend on energy, agriculture, housing, all the things the state should be managing instead of the Fed from Washington, D.C., at 2,000 miles away. New York spends $229 billion. They'd get 86. They have 6% of the population. 86 more billion out of 230. That's 30% more budget dollars for New York to manage energy, agriculture, transportation in the state of New York. Illinois spends $53 billion. Their share, they get 4%, would be $56 billion. They actually end up doubling, getting 100%. Is this right? I think this is right. These numbers were pulled a while ago, 6, 7, 8 months, but Wow, Illinois would double the money they had to spend. Imagine what you could do in the city of Chicago if they had double the budget, double the state budget. Think the state legislature would help the city of Chicago? Would the state of New York legislature help the city of New York if they had all these extra funds to address transportation, housing, healthcare, education? Do you think? You think the state would do a better job than the Fed of building economy in the state and addressing the problems that existed in the state by prioritizing the spending to address whatever situation the state felt, mostly like in D.C.? Think they should spend money on education in public schools? Or should they spend it on, what, agriculture? Put gardens on top of all the 10-story buildings in D.C.? They're not going to fix the public education system. D.C. is not a state, so it's a bad example, but you get the idea. How about, well, let's look at some of these other states. I got them all here. New Jersey. New Jersey spends $56.7 billion. They'd get $40 billion extra. Virginia spends $92.6 billion. They'd get $36 billion more. Tennessee spends $52 billion. They'd get $30 billion more. Massachusetts spends $58 billion. They'd get $30 billion more. Every single one of these, all the way down to the small states at the end of the list. Wyoming spends $5.5 billion. They'd get $3.34 more, almost 50% more. Vermont, $8.6. They'd get $3.34. Alaska spends $14.2. They got a lot of oil revenues in Alaska, despite the fact they got a teeny-weeny percent of the population, like Vermont and Wyoming. They'd get $3.34 billion more as well. Delaware spends $6 billion. They'd get $3.34 billion. Rhode Island spends $14 billion. They'd get $6.68, almost $7 billion, 50%. So you can see every single one of the states would have available to them at least 50% more money to spend in their state. Because the state legislatures aren't going to give these contracts to big companies in Virginia, Maryland, New York, or Florida, or Europe, or Mexico, or California. They're going to give the contracts to in-state operators, so the jobs will be in state, the construction will be in state, the employment, the infrastructure, the new economy. The benefits will accrue in each state, not just in Washington, D.C., to Congress and the lobbyists. So closing the government next Tuesday opens the door to fixing, well, gee, a lot. Fixing the budget, fixing the money, fixing the revenue. And of course, as you know, they need to get rid of the income tax. It's a total fraud. It needs to be replaced with a tax on corporate earnings, no deductions, no expenses, no losses, no write-downs, 5% of everything every business earns every month, send it in. No tax on profit, no tax on income. The whole income tax is a complete and total fraud. The American people were never intended to be the subjects of an income tax. There's no profit, redefined as income, in an hour of labor. It's an equal exchange of value for value. There's no profit in an hour of labor or an hourly wage. If there were a profit in hourly wage experienced by either side of the agreement, the other side of the agreement would walk away from it within a week. There's no profit in hour labor. It's not income, it's earnings. And the tax is supposed to be on profit, income, not earnings redefined as profit through a Canadian tax treaty, which is where Section 61 gross income comes from. It was never domestic legislation. Section 61 gross income was legislation enacted in 1918, 5 years after the original income tax legislation. And the original legislation it was enacted as a part of is a Canadian tax treaty that lasted for 75 years from 1918 to 1993, when it was replaced with NAFTA, which has since been replaced with the MCA. There's no more tax treaty with Canada. Section 61 is dead letter law. It was enacted under a treaty that expired in 1993, and it hasn't had any legal, real application as law within the 50 states for over 32 years. It's dead letter law. There's no taxation of you because you worked. The whole thing is a constitutional fraud based on the fraudulent claim dreamed up by the lower courts that there's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment. Well, that's a lie. That's the constitutional fraud. Supreme Court says, in a case last year, Moore et al. v. United States, 602 U.S. 572, that income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Well, that Article 1, Section 8 only authorizes the taxation of foreign activity, foreign persons, foreign imports, and in foreign places by impost. It only authorizes the taxation of exported goods by duty and the taxation of commodities, licenses, and corporations by excise. So where's the authority under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 to tax the labor of the American people as though it were all profit? It doesn't exist. It has never existed. It's been a constitutional fraud. The direct non-apportioned tax they've been enforcing since 1980 is required by the Constitution and more to be apportioned to the several states. They're not allowed to enforce a direct tax against individual defendants, neither civilly for money nor criminally for offense. There is no direct tax to fail to pay or to evade and defeat or to oppose. It's all been constitutional fraud, and every single piece of property taken from individuals for 50 years has been seditious treason committed by the federal judges who are stealing property and forcing a direct tax that has to be apportioned to the several states for payment. The judges have betrayed you by deciding to enforce straight-up communism instead of indirect constitutional taxation. The class legislation of the federal income tax is 100% unconstitutional. They can't tax the rich, the middle class, and the poor at different rates any more than they can tax the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims at 3 different rates. Or the blacks, or the whites, or the browns at 3 different rates. Or the yellow and the red at a 4th and a 5th. Or the Italian at 1 rate, the Irish at another, the Canadian at a 3rd, and the Mexican at a 4th. None of these graduated taxes are legitimate when imposed or enforced against the American people, who are only allowed under the Constitution to be taxed uniformly. You can no more tax the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor differently than you can tax the Jew and the Christian. And it doesn't matter that the wealthy in all 50 states are treated the same as in each of the other, and that the poor are all treated the same. Geographical uniformity is nonsense when applied to the people rather than the articles and commodities subject to taxation, or the inanimate corporate person or licensed person. They can be taxed based on a power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate commodities and articles of commerce subject to tax, the inanimate corporate person, and they can be discriminated against based on the amount of privilege, amount of earnings derived from the privilege enjoyed. So a company makes $10 million, it can be taxed at a higher rate than a company making $100,000. But geographical uniformity is a fraud when imposed on the American people. It opens the door to taxing the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim different, the Irish, the Italian different, the man, the woman, the young, the old. Oh, and it's okay as long as they're all treated the same in all 50 states under the geographical uniformity theory. Baloney. It's a lie. It's class legislation that constitutes the essence of communism. We'll be back next week with more.